Clarence Boone's body hit the pavement with a sickening thud as handcuffs clamped around his frail wrists, his only crime, sitting quietly on a park bench. Bystanders froze, phones shaking in their hands, too afraid to intervene. But just as the officers tightened their grip, a deep voice cut through the tension, calm, commanding, and unmistakably powerful. "Let him go. Now." Clarence Boone, a dignified 78-year-old retired history teacher known for his quiet wisdom and unwavering self-respect, was enjoying a rare moment of tranquility on a balmy March afternoon at Riverside Park in Baltimore, a favored retreat for locals seeking respite from the relentless pace of urban life. Seated on an aged wooden bench beneath the sprawling canopy of a centuries-old oak, he leafed through a worn paperback of historical accounts, his gentle eyes reflecting the depth of his lifelong experiences. The park was alive with the soft murmur of voices, the distant laughter of children, and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a refreshing breeze. Yet on this day, the harmony of nature and community was shattered in the most jarring fashion by the arrival of two uniformed figures whose presence would plunge the afternoon into an ordeal that none could have foreseen. Officer Darren Lowe, a burly man of 35 with a stern gaze and an air of self-importance, accompanied by his partner, Officer Mitchell Grady, a younger and more impulsive man of 29, strode purposefully toward Clarence with expressions that betrayed suspicion rather than the calm assurance one might expect from those sworn to protect and serve. As they approached, their voices cutting through the ambient chorus of the park, they demanded to know why a man of Clarence's age, dressed modestly in a cardigan and slacks, was lingering in the park at such a late hour. Despite his measured, respectful tone as he tried to explain that he was simply enjoying the peaceful respite of an afternoon spent reflecting on days gone by, their inquiries quickly escalated into baseless accusations. Before Clarence could fully articulate his words, Officer Lowe barked out orders that left no room for dialogue, and in a single, brutal moment, he forcefully shoved the frail man to the ground. The gentle thud of Clarence's body against the weathered pavement elicited gasps from nearby. Park-goers, many of whom instinctively reached for their smartphones to record the shocking event, though fear and uncertainty kept most from intervening openly. For a few long, agonizing minutes, the scene was marred by the discordant sounds of gruff commands and the muffled protests of bystanders who dared not step forward, until fate intervened in the form of Donovan D.J. Hayes, a 45-year-old ex-heavyweight boxing champion renowned not only for his past glories in the ring but also for his steadfast integrity and quiet reclusion since retiring from professional fighting. Strolling along a nearby path, Donovan's keen eyes detected the unfolding injustice as his heart pounded with a familiar mix of indignation and a sense of moral duty. Without hesitating or succumbing to the fear that grips many who witness abuse of power, he strode briskly toward the commotion, his presence unmistakable and his resolve palpable. As he neared, Donovan's deep voice rang out over the uproar, asking sharply, "What are you doing?" His words cut through the haze of confusion like a clarion call for justice, demanding that the officers halt their unwarranted mistreatment. In that electric moment, the tide began to turn. Officer Grady, his face contorted with annoyance and uncertainty, exchanged a bewildered glance with Officer Lowe, realizing perhaps too late that this stranger was not merely a passer by but a force to be reckoned with, one whose reputation, rooted in the raw power and discipline of boxing, lent weight to his courageous intervention. Donovan's imposing figure, once a symbol of strength in a celebrated sports arena, now transformed into a guardian in a civic setting, challenged the authority that had been so carelessly misused. His stance was calm yet unyielding, his eyes locked onto the officers with a mixture of righteous fury and the quiet assurance that only true champions of justice possess. The surrounding crowd, initially paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, began to murmur in support, their cell phones still capturing every unfolding moment. Just then, as if drawn by the escalating tension and the public's growing disquiet, Lieutenant Raymond Nash, a seasoned and imposing figure of 52, emerged on the scene. His arrival was like a gust of fresh wind dispelling a tempest. His measured steps and authoritative gaze served as a clear indication that higher command was now present. Scanning the situation with a mixture of disapproval and determination, Lieutenant Nash demanded that the officers release Clarence immediately. "Let him go now," he commanded, his voice resonating with both duty and a promise of accountability. The lieutenant then turned his attention to Donovan, inviting him to explain the events as he had witnessed them. With careful, deliberate words, Donovan recounted the dramatic sequence, the baseless questioning, the brute force that had sent Clarence sprawling on the hard pavement, the desperate attempts by bystanders to record but not to rescue. His testimony was delivered with the clarity of someone who had long since laid down his fists, yet whose moral spirit still burned with the need to defend the powerless. Faced with this compelling narrative and the growing clamor of an increasingly united public, Lieutenant Nash assured everyone that a full-scale internal investigation would be launched immediately. His measured tone left no room for further abuse, and with a stern nod to his subordinates, the order was given to unhand Clarence and secure the scene for further inquiry. In that transformative moment, the residents of Baltimore, who had long silently endured the misuses of authority, found within themselves a spark of collective courage. As the video footage of the incident began to circulate on social media, drawing widespread attention and sparking a nationwide conversation about police conduct and systemic injustice, it became evident that this incident was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a catalyst for change. The courage of Donovan Hayes had not only protected a vulnerable individual but also united a community in its demand for respect, dignity, and accountability from those sworn to uphold the law. This episode at Riverside Park was destined to be remembered not merely as a story of abuse of power, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit when it dares to confront injustice head-on. Clarence's ordeal and Donovan's intervention symbolized a turning point, a moment when ordinary citizens and unexpected heroes stepped forward to challenge a system that too often allowed prejudice and brutality to go unchecked. The legacy of that March afternoon would soon ripple outward, altering the course of public discourse and inspiring countless others to stand tall in the face of authority abuse. As the sun dipped lower over Baltimore, casting long shadows across the park, the whispers of that unforgettable day began to knit themselves into the fabric of a city now awakened to the possibility of change. And while Clarence Boone, with his quiet dignity, returned to his modest life, and Donovan Hayes resumed his solitary walks through the park, their actions had set in motion a movement, a new call for justice that would echo in the hearts of those who believed in a fairer, more compassionate future for all. The echoes of that fateful afternoon at Riverside Park had barely faded when the first clip hit social media. Just minutes after Lieutenant Raymond Nash ordered the release of Clarence Boone and launched an internal investigation, dozens of shaky yet powerful videos taken by parkgoers flooded TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. The clips captured it all: an elderly black man shoved to the ground by two police officers, handcuffed despite offering no resistance, and the unmistakable voice of a bystander, Donovan D.J. Hayes, intervening with calm authority. Viewers across the country watched in disbelief as the footage revealed a raw and unfiltered truth that many had experienced but few had ever seen so publicly and so clearly. The internet did what it does best: it amplified the outrage, connected stories, and demanded accountability. Within hours, the name Clarence Boone trended nationwide, alongside hashtags like #JusticeForBoone and #StandWithDonovan. National news outlets picked up the story, airing the clips with voiceover commentary and expert legal analysis. Civil rights organizations issued statements. Law professors and community leaders called for swift action. But for the people of Baltimore, the footage wasn't just a viral moment, it was a mirror held up to their own city's long-buried wounds. The following morning, the mayor's office released a statement acknowledging the video and promising transparency. The chief of police called an emergency press conference, where he appeared grim and unusually contrite. "We have seen the footage," he began, the air heavy with tension. "And we have placed officers Darren Lowe and Mitchell Grady on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. An external review board is being assembled to oversee this matter." Behind closed doors, the Internal Affairs Department scrambled to regain control of the narrative. But it was too late. The truth had already spoken, through pixels, sound bites, and the righteous anger of the public. As more footage surfaced, piecing together different angles and audio, the story only grew more damning. In some clips, Officer Lowe could be heard accusing Clarence of loitering, even as the elderly man calmly explained he was simply reading a book. In others, Officer Grady's voice dripped with sarcasm as he ignored Clarence's explanation and refused to acknowledge Donovan's presence until the confrontation escalated. A particularly sharp moment that caught fire online was Donovan stepping forward, saying firmly, "He's not hurting anyone, he's just sitting. You don't have the right to treat him like that." The moment he uttered those words, the entire internet seemed to exhale and then erupt. Comment sections were flooded with thousands of voices demanding justice, recalling their own experiences, sharing how they too had once been accused, dismissed, or ignored. Clarence Bone, who had quietly retired from decades of teaching Baltimore's youth about history, suddenly became a living example of the injustice he had once warned his students about. And Donovan Hayes, who had long avoided the spotlight since retiring from boxing, found himself thrust into a role he neither sought nor shied away from, that of a leader. For days, Donovan avoided interviews. He didn't care for microphones or talking heads. But after a brief meeting with Clarence and his family, and after encouragement from the local NAACP chapter, he agreed to speak at a community town hall. The church auditorium was filled to the rafters with residents, journalists, activists, and young students who had seen the video and now wanted to see the man behind the voice. Donovan stepped onto the stage wearing a simple black hoodie and jeans. His voice, low and steady, filled the room with a presence more powerful than any sermon. "What happened to Mr. Boone," he said, "wasn't just about him. It was about all of us. It was about every time someone gets looked at and labeled before they even say a word. We all saw what happened, and now we can't unsee it." Silence, he paused, letting the word settle like a stone in still water, is no longer an option. The room erupted. Cheers mixed with tears. Cameras flashed. And just like that, a new chapter of Baltimore's civil rights legacy began. Meanwhile, the independent investigation panel convened. It included former judges, civil rights attorneys, and community representatives. The video evidence, along with Clarence's detailed statement and Donovan's first-hand account, left little room for interpretation. What emerged from the inquiry was not just an isolated case of misconduct, it was a pattern. Both officers Lowe and Grady had multiple prior complaints on record, ranging from racially biased stops to excessive force. Each time, the complaints had been dismissed as inconclusive or lacking sufficient evidence. But not this time. The media had latched on. The people had woken up. And the truth had gone viral. Peaceful protests sprang up outside the city hall and the police department. Crowds carried signs bearing Clarence's name and face, demanding reform. Students from the university marched with banners quoting Donovan's now iconic line, "Silence is no longer an option." Faith leaders joined hands with youth organizers, and for the first time in a long time, Baltimore felt less divided and more unified by a shared purpose. 1 week later, the police department announced the termination of both officers, citing violations of protocol, abuse of power, and conduct unbecoming of public servants. But the story didn't end there. City council members introduced a motion for police reform, calling for new standards in de-escalation training and community oversight. A special committee was formed to review all prior cases of misconduct swept under the rug. And more importantly, Lieutenant Raymond Nash, who had acted decisively on the scene, was asked to lead the task force. When interviewed, Lieutenant Nash spoke plainly, "I did what was right. But let's be honest, we should have been doing what's right a long time ago." That honesty, rare and refreshing, was part of what made the public trust him. Nash proposed a complete overhaul of the department's training programs, including mandatory bias recognition, conflict resolution workshops, and an open-door complaint system monitored by third-party citizens. And while the city debated logistics and politics, Donovan and Clarence continued their work on the ground. They visited schools, spoke at churches, and appeared on local radio programs. Wherever they went, they brought not just a story of what happened, but a call to action. During a televised roundtable discussion, Clarence sat beside Donovan and said, "I've spent my life teaching history. I never thought I'd become part of it. But if what happened to me helps wake this city up, then it was worth every bruise." The moderator asked Donovan if he saw himself as a hero. He shook his head, glanced at Clarence, then looked directly into the camera. "I'm not a hero. I just refused to walk away when I saw something wrong. That's not heroism, that's being human." And in that moment, millions watching at home felt a shift, not in policy, not yet in legislation, but in spirit. Because when the camera spoke, it did more than reveal injustice. It inspired a community to listen, to rise, and to act. And that made all the difference. The city of Baltimore hadn't felt this kind of shift in years. After the viral footage of Clarence Boone's wrongful detainment sent shockwaves across the nation and the subsequent fallout resulted in the firing of officers Darren Lowe and Mitchell Grady, the streets buzzed not only with outrage, but with something rarer, momentum. The peaceful protests had not fizzled out as so many others had. Instead, they evolved into focused demands. School gymnasiums, church halls, and community centers across the city were packed with residents, clergy, students, and activists, all echoing one common sentiment: something needed to change, and it needed to change now. At the center of that movement stood Donovan DJ Hayes, a man who once commanded roars from sold-out arenas, now commanding attention with soft-spoken conviction and unwavering resolve. The same man who had stepped forward when no one else did. The same man whose words, "Silence is no longer an option," had become a rallying cry painted on protest signs and screen printed across t-shirts worn in every corner of the city. But Donovan didn't see himself as a hero. If anything, he saw himself as a bridge. A bridge between pain and action, between outrage and reform. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. At one town hall, a young woman asked him what justice looked like. Donovan paused, then said, "Justice is not just the absence of violence. It's the presence of dignity." His voice didn't need to be loud. His story, his actions, carried all the volume necessary. At his side stood Clarence Boone, no longer just a retired teacher but now a symbol of lived history, of quiet endurance, of dignity that refused to be broken. Clarence began appearing alongside Donovan at community events, sharing his truth not with anger but with steady reflection. "What happened to me," he would say, "wasn't new. It was just finally caught on camera. The difference now is that we're all watching, and we're all done pretending not to see." Their partnership sparked something powerful. Where Donovan brought fire, Clarence brought foundation. Where one challenged, the other reminded. Together, they weren't just fighting back, they were building forward. Inspired by the groundswell of support and the credibility that Donovan and Clarence brought, Lieutenant Raymond Nash, who had decisively de-escalated the confrontation on that fateful afternoon, stepped forward with a bold proposition. Rather than offering another statement or another apology, he proposed action. Real action. The city's police department, under pressure and scrutiny, agreed to implement sweeping reforms. At a press conference held on the steps of City Hall, Lieutenant Nash outlined a new vision. "We cannot undo what happened to Mr. Boone," he began, his voice firm, "but we can make sure it never happens again. This is not about covering our bases, it's about rebuilding our foundation." He announced the immediate launch of a new initiative within the department: mandatory training in de-escalation tactics, implicit bias, and community cultural awareness. Officers would no longer just be taught how to react, they would be taught how to relate, to listen, and to serve with empathy, not ego. A third-party civilian review board was created, composed of educators, clergy, civil rights attorneys, and neighborhood leaders. This board would handle all complaints of misconduct, with full access to case files and the power to recommend disciplinary action. Most importantly, a new digital platform was introduced, allowing anonymous reporting from citizens who feared retaliation. Every tip would be tracked, reviewed, and responded to within a fixed time frame. The community would no longer shout into a void. They would speak, and the system would be required to listen. The reaction to these changes was mixed at first. Some officers bristled. Others feared losing authority. But those who truly believed in their oath embraced the challenge. "If you're not willing to change," Nash said pointedly during an internal meeting, "then you have no business wearing the badge." The reforms didn't stop at the department's doors. Schools began hosting open forums where students could voice concerns about safety and racial profiling. Churches held monthly reconciliation dinners between officers and residents. Art collectives launched mural campaigns, transforming abandoned walls into visual testaments of unity and resistance. Hashtags like #JusticeForBoone and #StandWithDonovan evolved beyond online trends. They became movements, visible, vocal, and relentless. One mural, painted on the side of a youth center in East Baltimore, depicted Clarence sitting on a bench, book in hand, with the ghostly shadow of injustice looming behind him, until a towering figure, Donovan, stood between them. In bold script beneath it read, "We rise when one stands." Media outlets, initially focused on the outrage, began shifting their coverage to the rebuilding. National news featured segments titled Baltimore's Reform Blueprint. Other cities began reaching out to Lieutenant Nash and Donovan for guidance. And while the reforms weren't perfect, no system ever is, the progress was real. The change was happening not just in policy, but in people. In a powerful moment captured during a community listening session, a rookie officer stood up and said, "I joined the force to protect people. But I realize now that protecting also means understanding. I want to be part of the solution." That single sentence earned him a standing ovation. For Clarence, the recognition was overwhelming at times. Once a quiet educator, he was now a symbol, invited to speak at colleges, churches, and even national panels. But he remained grounded. "All I ever wanted was peace," he said during a televised interview. "Now, I just hope we've given this city a little more of it." Donovan, too, felt the weight of his new role. At night, he still walked the trails of Riverside Park, seeking the silence that once defined his retirement. But now, those walks were different. Strangers stopped to shake his hand. Children called out his name. And sometimes, he'd find Clarence waiting on their old bench, book in hand, nodding with that familiar quiet wisdom. The two men often sat together in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because they had already said enough to move a city. Their bond, forged in fire, became a testament to what happens when courage meets character. In the end, their story wasn't about a viral video, or even about two men who stood up when it mattered most. It was about what followed. About a city that chose to listen instead of defend. About a department that chose to reform instead of resist. About people who chose to believe that justice wasn't some far-off idea, but a daily decision. The bench where it all began was eventually restored and made into a commemorative site. A small plaque was added beside it. It read, "Here, injustice sat. But so did truth. And truth stood." Tourists came to see it. Locals came to remember. And children, wide-eyed and hopeful, sat where Clarence once did, dreaming not of fear, but of fairness. Baltimore didn't become perfect. No city ever does. But it became braver, more honest, and more united. And that, Clarence once said with a soft smile, is how a legacy begins. As the author of this story, I want to take a moment to reflect on what Clarence Boone and Donovan Hayes taught us, not just through their words, but through their actions. This story began on a simple park bench. A moment that should have been peaceful turned into a moment of injustice, unprovoked, undeserved, and deeply painful. But it was in that moment of darkness that something powerful was born: courage. Clarence Boone, a man of quiet dignity and history, showed us that even in the face of humiliation, we can stand tall by standing firm in our truth. And Donovan Hayes, a man who could have walked away like everyone else, chose instead to confront injustice head-on, not with violence or anger, but with clarity, strength, and a deep sense of right and wrong. Their story reminds us that justice is not a destination, it's a daily commitment. It's not enough to feel bad when we see something wrong. We must speak. We must act. Because silence, as Donovan said, is no longer an option. We live in a world where prejudice still lingers in places it should have been long erased. And often, those who are most affected by injustice are also the ones whose voices are most easily dismissed. But change doesn't always start with institutions, it starts with people. People like you. People like Donovan. People like Clarence. Let this story be more than just a narrative you heard today. Let it be a reminder that in everyday places, in parks, in schools, in neighborhoods, real change begins when someone chooses to stand up. It begins with accountability, with compassion, with the simple but courageous decision to say, "This isn't right, and I won't let it happen in silence." To our viewers and listeners, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. Thank you for choosing to engage in conversations that matter. Your support allows us to continue shining a light on the moments that shape communities and inspire action. If this story moved you, we encourage you to share it, because the more we spread awareness, the closer we get to building a society where dignity, fairness, and justice are not ideals, but everyday realities. From all of us here at US Daily Story, we deeply appreciate your time, your heart, and your voice. Keep standing for what's right. Keep amplifying what matters. And above all, never underestimate the power of one person to spark lasting change. Until next time, stay strong, stay aware, and stay united.